head of state is the most protected passenger in any country. Their aircraft gets its own maintenance schedule and a hand-picked crew, and it moves through airspace the rest of us wait behind. That protection has failed often enough to fill this video. Presidents, prime ministers, and one Secretary General of the United Nations have all come down in aircraft their governments called safe, and some of those files are still open 65 years later. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura. In the spring of 1940, around 22,000 Polish officers, police and officials disappeared into Soviet custody, and their families spent 50 years being told a lie about it. Moscow blamed Germany for what had happened in the forest at Katyn, and finally admitted the truth in 1990. On the 10th of April 2010, a Polish delegation flew to Smolensk in Russia for the 70th anniversary. The passenger list was most of a state: President Lech Kaczynski and his wife Maria, Ryszard Kaczorowski, who had been Poland's president in exile through the communist years, the chief of the general staff and the commanders of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Special Forces, 88 passengers and 8 crew. The aircraft was a Tupolev 154, operating as Polish Air Force Flight 101. 2 years earlier, the same presidential aircraft had been over the Black Sea during the war between Russia and Georgia. Kaczynski was carrying the presidents of Estonia, Lithuania, and Ukraine to show solidarity with Tbilisi, and the plan was to land in Azerbaijan and drive the rest of the way. Mid-flight, he ordered the crew to fly straight into Georgia instead. The captain refused, on the grounds that they were missing diplomatic clearance and current data on Georgian navigation systems, and that anyone's air defenses would see them as an unidentified aircraft. Kaczynski came into the cockpit and asked who commanded the armed forces. The captain told him he did, and the president told him to carry out the order, and walked out while the crew were still answering. The captain held his ground. A senior Air Force officer then telephoned from Warsaw and asked whether the man in the right seat could take over and fly to Georgia instead. He refused as well, saying a Polish presidential aircraft over a war zone could be taken for a hostile and shot at. They landed in Azerbaijan. Kaczynski told the delegation afterward that a man who chooses to be an officer should not be fearful. The man, who had been sitting in the right seat that day, went on to command the aircraft at Smolensk. Smolensk North is a former military airfield with no instrument landing system. That morning it was under fog with visibility around 400 meters, against a required minimum of 1,000. The controller passed the figures twice and told them there were no conditions for landing. The tower also told them a Russian Ilyushin had already tried the approach twice, given up, and gone elsewhere. The recording of the last 39 minutes catches a foreign ministry official coming onto the flight deck and saying the president had not yet decided what they were doing. They started the approach with 2 sets of numbers already wrong. The controller's radar was out of calibration and showed the aircraft up to 150 meters closer to the runway than it was, so his distance calls ran early by around half a kilometer, and the captain's electronic altimeter had been reset to a figure 170 meters above where the aircraft actually was. Every other altimeter aboard read correctly. Somebody made that change after the final approach began, moments after the first terrain warning. They came down at roughly twice the rate the approach called for. At 180 meters, the terrain warning sounded and the descent continued. At 100 meters, the decision height, the Russian transcript records no call from the captain to land or to climb away, which obliges the first officer to take the aircraft and go around. Polish investigators argue the call happened and got buried under a simultaneous alert. 1 second later, the system began calling pull-up and kept calling it to the end. The go-around started 39 meters above the runway level and 1,600 meters short of it, by which point the aircraft was already below the trees on the approach path. It struck them. Rolled and came down inverted in woodland, killing everyone aboard. The Russian committee reported in January 2011, and the Polish Commission in July, and on the mechanism they agreed. The crew stayed on an approach they should have abandoned, and went below the minimum without seeing the ground, then climbed away far too late. The Russian report added that the Air Force commander had entered the cockpit during the approach, and that his presence pushed the captain toward landing at any cost, and it recorded alcohol in that officer's blood, which Poland rejected. The Polish report put more weight on the state of the airfield and the controller's errors. Warsaw had agreed at the start that Moscow would run the investigation under civil rules rather than the military ones Polish law required, which handed Russia the evidence. 16 years on, the wreckage sits where it fell. In 2016, a Polish defense minister opened a separate inquiry, and in 2022, it announced 2 explosive events had brought the aircraft down. An American laboratory had already tested wreckage samples for explosive residue and found none, and that result stayed out of the published findings. A new government closed the inquiry in December 2023. The following October, the Defense Ministry published a review describing large-scale irregularities and around 80 million zloty spent on methodology that in places contradicted physics. Emails showed the chairman had offered a British aviation expert £5,000 to change a report, and the expert told him it amounted to a bribe. In 2025, Parliament lifted that chairman's immunity and charged him. The approach chart for Dubrovnik had a number on it that was lower than the mountain. Croatian authorities had built the procedure using international criteria and misapplied them, taking the wrong rules for the final segment and missing the obstacle that should have governed the whole thing. They published a minimum descent altitude of 2,150 feet, and when American investigators recalculated it properly, they got figures between 2,600 and 2,800. Flying that chart exactly as printed put an aircraft under the terrain. That chart was the only instrument approach into Dubrovnik. The airport had once had a full landing system and 2 other navigation beacons, and all of that equipment disappeared during the war that had ended 6 months earlier. On the 3rd of April 1996, the aircraft flying it was carrying the United States Secretary of Commerce. Ron Brown was 54 and leading a trade mission into a country trying to rebuild. Behind him were 12 Commerce Department officials, executives from American construction and engineering firms, 29 passengers and 6 crew, 35 people. The airplane was a Boeing 737 from Ramstein in Germany, built as a navigator trainer and converted in 1992 to carry senior officials. As a government aircraft, it fell outside the rules requiring recorders, and it carried neither a cockpit voice recorder nor a flight data recorder. Air Force regulations said its crew should not have been flying that approach at all. Any chart the Defense Department had not published needed a technical review first, and Dubrovnik had never had one. When a group commander asked for a blanket waiver, a staff officer telephoned the agency that issues them and came away believing he had one verbally, then put that in an email. The agency testified afterward that its records showed no such request and that waivers exist only in writing, but by then a notice had gone out to every crew in the wing. Air Force headquarters explicitly disapproved it in January. The wing kept flying the approaches, and when somebody in February noticed and told them to stop, the instruction died in the chain. Commanders rescinded it the day after the crash. That approach uses 2 beacons, one out on an island to mark the descent point, and one at the runway to mark where a missed approach begins. Flying it requires 2 receivers. The airplane had one, and the crew planned the leg believing they were equipped for it. At 6 minutes to 3, they crossed the island beacon at 4,100 feet, roughly 30 knots faster than the manual allowed, with the flaps nowhere near a landing setting. They had not been cleared for the approach. The tower expected them to hold, and said so in Croatian to another aircraft. The published course inbound was 119 degrees, and they settled onto 110 and held it there. The airplane leveled at 2,200 feet, which is what the chart told them to do. At 7 minutes to 3, it struck a rocky hillside 2 miles north of the runway threshold and nearly 2 miles left of the centerline. Gear down and flaps set for landing, with both engines at high power. The ground proximity warning system stayed silent, and engineers reconstructed it afterward to find out why. The terrain was rising slower than the threshold that triggers a warning, and the landing configuration had switched off the other modes, so the equipment ran to specification all the way in. Rescuers began searching over water, because the approach is over water. A man living at the base of the mountain heard the impact and took it for a grenade. He saw the wreckage 3 hours later, had no telephone, and drove half an hour down a mountain road in fog and rain to find one. Police reached the site at 7:20 and found 4 people in the tail section. An airport officer checked for pulses and found none, and testified later that his training had left that out. At 9:30, one of them made a sound. Technical Sergeant Shelley Kelly, a flight attendant from Zanesville, Ohio, had been in the tail with a broken spine for 6.5 hours. Police bandaged her leg and got her onto a stretcher, then refused to carry her down in that weather. A Croatian officer told an American helicopter crew they were afraid to touch her, because moving her on foot would kill her. The helicopter tried, and could not get through the cloud. They carried her down anyway, and she died in the ambulance before midnight. The impact had killed everyone else aboard. The Air Force published its findings on the 7th of June, and named 3 causes without ranking them: a failure of command, air crew error, and an improperly designed approach procedure. The board examined the weather closely and eliminated it. It had already relieved 3 officers of duty, one of them a brigadier general. Federal inspectors' flight tested both beacons 5 days after the crash and found them satisfactory. Brown had been under investigation by an independent counsel when he died, and the argument that the crash was something other than an accident started within weeks and is still running. Some of it came from inside the military, when a small number of pathologists questioned how the examination of his remains had been handled. The Armed Forces Institute of Pathology reviewed the case and found the injuries consistent with the impact. That aircraft flew without a recorder of any kind, which is why the argument has lasted 30 years. He was not supposed to be on that aircraft. The Cessna had been chartered by Adelino Amaro da Costa, Portugal's defense minister and the first civilian ever to hold the post. Francisco Sá Carneiro, the prime minister, had planned to travel another way and joined at the last minute with his partner Snu Abacassis. The defense minister brought his wife. The prime minister's chief of staff came along, and with 2 pilots that made 7. They were flying to a rally in Porto. Portugal's presidential election was 3 days away. The aircraft left Lisbon on the evening of the 4th of December 1980 and came down less than a minute later. People watching said it was shedding pieces as it climbed. It struck high-voltage power lines and went into a building at Camarate, a few hundred meters from the airport, and burned. Everyone aboard was killed. The Aviation Authority investigated and concluded it was an accident caused by a lack of fuel in one of the tanks. The police report the following year found the crash to be entirely non-criminal. In 1983, the Attorney General suspended the investigation. Portugal has spent the 45 years since then trying to reopen it, mostly through Parliament. There have been at least 8 commissions of inquiry into this single crash. The ones in 1990 and 1991 changed nothing. The 5th, in 1995, found what it took to be evidence of sabotage and the case was reopened. The bodies were exhumed. The forensic report that followed concluded there had probably been no explosion aboard, while declining to rule one out. Investigators then interviewed a man named José Esteves, and the criminal proceedings went back into abeyance. A private prosecution brought by the families ran into the 15-year limit in 1996. One alleged conspirator was exempt because he was in custody in Brazil on other matters, and that paused the clock in his case. So in 1998, a district court judge ruled once more that the crash had been an accident, and the appeal court upheld him in 2000 in a judgment running to 800 pages. An attempt to reopen it the following year on new evidence arrived too late, and the Supreme Court cleared away what was left in 2006. The families went to the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that Portuguese negligence had run out the clock on them, and in 2011 that court found the Portuguese authorities had acted properly throughout. In December 2004, in the middle of all that, the 8th Parliamentary Commission reported. Its chairman, Nuno Melo, said they had evidence of an explosive device placed under the floor of the pilot's cabin, powerful enough to damage the control cables and injure the men flying, and that chemical analysis of the wreckage had shown potassium and lead. Melo went back to Parliament in 2013 and put 2 dates in front of it. By then, the 15-year limit had long expired, and people had begun coming forward. Esteves said in 2006 that he had built an incendiary charge from potassium chlorate, sugar, and sulfuric acid, and that it was meant to start a fire on the ground before takeoff, so everyone could get out, as a warning to a presidential candidate. In 2013, he added that his device alone could not have brought the aircraft down, and that something else must have been aboard. Another man published a written confession online in 2011 describing his own role. Both men said the money had come from American intelligence. Every Portuguese court that could have tested those accounts ran out of time before it reached them. Porto's international airport carries Sá Carneiro's name. The aircraft was named after a song. Albertina was a hit by Papa Wendo, the biggest name in Congolese rumba, and somebody at the Swedish charter company Transair had painted it on the nose of their Douglas DC-6. On the night of the 17th of September 1961, that aircraft lifted out of Leopoldville, carrying 16 people, among them Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the United Nations. Congo had been independent from Belgium for a year and was already coming apart. Its richest province, Katanga, had seceded almost immediately with Belgian backing, because the copper and uranium under it were worth more than the country. Katanga's forces ran on white mercenaries hired out of Europe and South Africa, and they were fighting United Nations troops. Hammarskjöld was flying to Ndola in northern Rhodesia, a British territory that is now Zambia, to meet the Katangi's leader and try to arrange a ceasefire. Ndola Airport that night held a crowd of white officials inside the terminal and a crowd of black Zambians outside it, since the terminal was for whites only. The night was clear and moonlit with a little haze. Between 10 and 15 minutes past midnight, the tower cleared the Albertina to land, and the aircraft went quiet. Lord Alport, the senior British official on the ground, told people the Secretary General must have decided to go somewhere else. At around 3 in the morning, the controller closed the runway and switched off the tower lights. Whatever recording existed of that night's tower communications remains missing. Charcoal burners working in the forest 9 miles out had already seen it. 2 of them described the same thing to investigators later. A large aircraft with a smaller one above it, something coming from the smaller one, a flash, and then the big aircraft going down. One of them saw the small one fly away afterward. In the morning, some charcoal burners found the burning wreck and went to Timothy Kankasa, the secretary of the African township at Twapia, rather than to the police, because they did not trust the police. Kankasa went out to the site, came back and telephoned a white officer he had dealt with for years. He said afterward there was no reason for the man to doubt him. The first vehicles arrived with half the afternoon already gone. Colonial officials recorded the discovery at 3:10, roughly 15 hours after the crash. An American air attaché sent to Ndola by the Pentagon days earlier later wrote that he had spotted the wreck shortly after dawn and radioed the coordinates in. Rescuers reached the site and found one man alive in it. Harold Julian was in his mid-30s, an American who had served in Korea with the Marines before joining the United Nations, and he was the acting chief security officer of its operation in Congo. He had burns across roughly half his body, along with a partial skull fracture, and he had been lying in the sun since dawn. That evening, a Northern Rhodesian police inspector asked him what had happened. Julian said the aircraft blew up, that they had been over the runway, that there was great speed and then the crash and then small explosions all around him. He said he had pulled the emergency release and got out and that everyone else was trapped. Over the following days, he told nurses that Hammarskjöld had said to turn back and that then there was an explosion. One nurse heard him talk about sparks in the sky. His wife flew in from Florida and was with him at the end. He died 5 days after the crash, of renal failure from his burns. A junior doctor who helped treat him said afterward that Julian was a strong young man who would have survived with the best care available at the time, and that the authorities kept him in a small hospital while Lusaka and the United States were both within reach. That doctor also insisted Julian had been lucid because he had spoken before receiving any sedation. The Rhodesian Commission of Inquiry set his account aside. It wrote that no attention need be paid to the remarks about sparks in the sky, which either related to the fire after the crash or to his medical condition. It concluded that the pilot had misjudged the height of the trees, and it reached that conclusion by eliminating everything else rather than by finding evidence for it. The Commission discarded nearly every statement a black witness gave it. The United Nations Commission returned an open verdict in 1962 and said it had found no indication that pilot error was the probable cause. That is why the General Assembly passed a resolution asking every future Secretary General to report any new evidence, and that resolution is why this case is still open. In 2019, the government of Zimbabwe handed the current inquiry documents showing that a senior Rhodesian intelligence official had gone to the hospital at Ndola and instructed the medical superintendent that none of his staff was to talk about what Julian had said. Justice Mohammed Chanda Othman has led the United Nations investigation since 2015 and has written that an external attack or threat is a plausible cause. He has asked governments to search their intelligence archives. Most have cooperated. Since 2017, the United Kingdom and South Africa have handed over a single document between them, which is none, and the United States has provided 2 that were already public. In October 2024, he reported that a small number of member states are still holding specific and crucial information back. 4 of the 16 people on the Albertina had been American citizens. He was trying to get home for a birthday. Samora Machel had led the guerrilla war that ended Portuguese rule and had been president of Mozambique since independence in 1975, and on the 19th of October, 1986, he was flying back from a summit in Zambia, with his wife Grace's birthday waiting in Maputo. Relations with South Africa had been collapsing for months. Machel had confronted Malawi over bases used by South African-backed rebels and threatened to strike first. Pretoria had responded by terminating 58,000 Mozambican jobs. Cabinet minutes from that period show the South African government believed Mozambique was close to collapse. The aircraft was a Tupolev 134 with a Soviet crew, carrying senior Mozambican officials, 2 Cuban doctors, and the ambassadors of Zambia and Zaire. Maputo has a radio navigation beacon transmitting on 112.7. Matsapa, across the border in Swaziland, transmits on 112.3. Every beacon also sends its own identifier in Morse code, and the standard procedure on that flight deck required the crew to listen and confirm which one they had tuned. The recorder shows them skipping that step and skipping the descent checklist. What it caught instead was an arrangement with the cabin crew about soft drinks and imported beers for later, and the captain looking for a pen while the first officer listened to a news bulletin. Then the aircraft turned 37 degrees right, away from Maputo. The ground proximity warning sounded. The crew believed they were over flat coastal ground on approach and treated the alert as false. At 22 minutes past 9, the Tupolev clipped a hilltop in the Lobombo Mountains at Mbuzini, a few hundred meters inside South Africa, where the borders of South Africa, Swaziland, and Mozambique meet. The crash killed 35 people and 9 came out alive. One of the survivors walked to a nearby house for help. By the time he got back, security force officers were already there. Others who came to assist, including a nurse, told investigators later that they were chased away from the wreck. They also said they watched officers going through the debris and taking documents. Pik Botha, the South African foreign minister and the head of the National Intelligence Service, both later confirmed that papers had been removed from the site to be copied. Pretoria informed Mozambique 9 hours after the crash. Botha was among the first officials to arrive. A police video shows him telling journalists at the wreckage that Machel and the others had been very good friends of his and of President Botha. The apartheid government appointed the Margot Commission. Its investigation stalled for weeks because a South African general had seized the cockpit voice recorder at the scene and kept it, and the officer running the police inquiry said it took a lawyer's letter to get it released. The commission concluded the aircraft was airworthy, that there was no evidence of sabotage or outside interference, and that the crew had abandoned the instrument approach to descend visually in darkness and cloud, disregarding their minimum safe altitude and the terrain alarm. The Soviet delegation refused to sign it and issued a minority report saying their expertise had been dismissed. They argued the crew had followed a beacon that was not Maputo's. Margot's own report accepted that much. It concluded the aircraft had turned toward a signal that did not come from Maputo, and suggested Matsapa's similar code had drawn them across. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reopened the file in the 1990s, it reached no conclusion of its own, and it collected a great deal that made the first one difficult. Maputo Airport's recordings from that night had gone missing. 2 pilots flying in the area said the Maputo signal came up unusually early. A South African Air Force flight sergeant testified that a month before the crash, he watched a colleague building a mobile beacon at a base near Pretoria, and he gave the commission technical sketches of it. He said the device left the base that weekend and came back the following week. Investigators were given the name of the man who built it and the name of the man who ordered it built. In August 1998, someone handed the commission the name of a person alleged to have erected a beacon on the mountainside at Mbuzini. The commission's mandate expired that same month, with that name still uninvestigated. Its written conclusion stayed close to what it could prove. The aircraft had entered restricted military airspace under continuous radar watch, and the head of the South African Air Force had already acknowledged that his service tracked it that night. Nobody passed a warning and nobody moved. Whatever anyone had intended, South Africa could have prevented the crash or reduced the number of people lost. On the hillside, there is now a monument of 35 steel pipes, one for every person, cut with small openings so that the wind coming over the Lobombo Mountains makes them sound like an aircraft going over. 2 days before he died, Jaime Roldós called the National Security Council together to discuss 2 things. One was permits and contracts for mining. The other was a national strategic agreement. He had been president of Ecuador for 21 months, elected at 38 as the country came out of nearly a decade of military rule, and he had built a foreign policy around human rights at a moment when most of the continent was run by generals. It made him popular at home and awkward abroad. He had refused to attend Ronald Reagan's inauguration in January. On the 24th of May, 1981, he spoke at a public event and used a phrase Ecuador still repeats about an Amazonian Ecuador from always and forever. Then he boarded the presidential aircraft for Loja in the south, where a ceremony was waiting for the men lost in that year's short border war with Peru. The aircraft was a Beechcraft Super King Air. 9 people were aboard: the president, the First Lady Martha Bucaram, the defense minister and his wife, 2 aides, a flight attendant, and both pilots. At about 2:30 in the afternoon, it struck Huairapungo Hill near Guachanama at 2,360 meters. The wreckage spread across 300 meters of mountainside, and the impact killed everyone. The Ecuadorian Air Force investigated the loss of its own presidential aircraft using its own accident committee and delivered a report within days. The finding was human error, a pilot flying low through mountains in bad weather and putting the aircraft into the hill. Roldós' family called the report premature, and there was nothing left aboard to check it against. because the aircraft had flown without a recorder. It took 34 years for a government to explain that. In 2015, the defense minister confirmed the presidential aircraft had been bought without one. The recorder had sat on the list of optional equipment alongside spare parts, and the pages of the procurement file carrying that list went into the archive with every signature line blank. When investigators later asked Beechcraft directly, the manufacturer answered that its records showed the aircraft leaving the factory without one. 4 separate investigations ran between 1981 and 1992, 2 of them military and 2 parliamentary. One of the military ones was conducted by the United States Air Force. In 1992, a multi-party commission of the Ecuadorian Congress, led by a deputy named Victor Granda, reported that the theory of a straightforward accident was barely credible. It went further and said that while it had no proof, the death of the president may have been the result of a deliberate act in which internal and external interests came together, and then the file sat untouched for 2 decades. In 2013, 2 Ecuadorian filmmakers released a documentary laying out the inconsistencies in the official account, and the Attorney General opened a preliminary inquiry that August. In 2015, he announced, on the strength of declassified American documents, that Ecuador had been part of Operation Condor between 1978 and 1980, the arrangement under which South American security services worked together against their political opponents. Roldós had opposed it, and the inquiry was now looking at whether his death was connected to that. In May 2016, the Attorney General's office reported that it had found material from the original investigation sitting in a military warehouse, including recordings and fragments believed to be from the aircraft. Granda, by then long out of Parliament, said the prosecutors should establish exactly what those fragments were and whether they meant anything. In 2019, a historian who had spent his career on the case asked formally for it to be reopened again. His specific complaints were harder to wave away than the theory behind them. Records had disappeared from the files and somebody had threatened witnesses. Farmers from the area around the crash site vanished, and a series of later aircraft accidents took the lives of military personnel connected to the original investigation. Prosecutors shelved the request and gave no reason. 45 years on, Ecuador still runs on the answer its Air Force wrote in the week after the crash. There is a path up Huairapungo now with wooden handrails, leading to the rock the aircraft hit, and his line about the Amazon is carved there. In Quechua, the name of the hill means the door of the wind. 68 days after Roldós went into that hillside, Omar Torrijos went into one in Panama. 4 of the 6 aircraft in this video went down with nothing aboard that recorded what happened. The American transport that hit the hill above Dubrovnik flew without a cockpit voice recorder or a flight data recorder, because government aircraft sat outside the rules that covered everyone else. The Swedish airliner in what is now Zambia predated the requirement entirely, and whatever tape the tower at Ndola made that night is still missing. The Cessna in Portugal was a light twin and carried nothing at all. Ecuador bought a presidential aircraft with the recorder sitting on the list of optional extras, and the page carrying that list went into the file with the signature line blank. 2 of the 6 did have recordings, and both of those investigations agreed on the mechanics. At Smolensk, the Russian and Polish commissions worked from the same tapes and reached the same account of what the aircraft had done. It came down too fast, went below its minimum without seeing the ground, and left the go-around too late. 16 years of argument since have been about pressure and responsibility rather than about any of that. At Mbuzini, the South African board and the Soviet delegation read the same recorder and drew the same technical conclusion, that the aircraft had turned toward a beacon, which was not Maputo's. Margot's own report says so. Everything else about that crash remains contested. The 4 cases with no recording produced 4 investigations that agree on almost nothing. Then there is the question of who got to hold the evidence. Ecuador's Air Force investigated the loss of the presidential aircraft it had itself bought without a recorder and delivered its finding inside a week. South Africa ran the investigation into an aircraft carrying the president of a country it was actively working against, and its own general kept the recorder until a lawyer's letter arrived. Russia took control of the Smolensk evidence because Warsaw agreed at the start that civil rules would apply rather than the military ones its own law required, and the wreckage is still there. One file in this video reached an answer and closed. The American board investigating Dubrovnik was examining its own Air Force, and it named a failure of command, an improperly designed approach in its own crew, and 3 officers including a brigadier general lost their posts. It was published in 9 weeks. Some of the rest was suppression, and the record now says so plainly. A Rhodesian intelligence officer went to the hospital at Ndola and told the medical superintendent that none of his staff was to repeat what the survivor had said, and that document only reached the United Nations in 2019. Somebody removed Maputo Airport's tapes from the archive. Evidence from the original Ecuadorian investigation sat in a military warehouse for 35 years before prosecutors found it in 2016. Most of it was simpler than that. The aircraft carrying the people who run countries have been flying without the equipment required on airliners, in places with thin radar coverage, into airports with a single instrument approach and no independent check on whether that approach was safe. Then somebody has to explain what happened, working from the ground up. That is why these files behave the way they do. Portugal's ran out of time under its own statute of limitations, while Parliament was still holding inquiries into it. Ecuador's prosecutors shelved the last request and gave no reason. South Africa's commission ran out its mandate in the month somebody handed it a name. One of them is still open and still being worked. In October 2024, the United Nations reported that a small number of member states continue to hold back specific and crucial information about a crash that happened 65 years ago and asked them again for it. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura.